It wasn't the music that kept me awake at night. When I was 13, my parents and I stayed for a week with my dad's cousins. They had a big house just outside town with one of those finished basements full of old furniture and mismatched rugs. The centerpiece of it was this music room that had been there for years. Piano in the corner, shelves of records, a couple of instruments hanging on the wall. Everyone in the family was allowed to use it. No locked doors, no strict rules. Most nights, someone would be down there playing guitar or listening to vinyl. At first, I liked it. The basement always smelled faintly like cedar and laundry soap, and the music made it feel warm. The stairs led right down from the kitchen, so you could hear whoever was playing from upstairs. But after a couple of nights, I started noticing the dogs. My cousins had two, quiet, easy-going animals who didn't bark much, except when they were downstairs. They would wander to the doorway of the music room, stand just inside the frame, and then suddenly start barking, not loud and frenzied, but sharp, evenly spaced barks, while staring into the far corner by the piano. Usually there was nobody there. The first time I was in the basement alone, I had just finished brushing my teeth in the little half bath near the laundry machines. I was drying my hands when there were 3 loud knocks on the door. Not random taps, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I called out, expecting someone to say they needed in, but there was nothing. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The stairs to the kitchen were right there, but I hadn't heard anyone walk away. It happened 2 more times that week. Always the same. I'd be in the bathroom, the door closed, and I'd hear those knocks, precise, like someone making sure I heard them. When I stepped out, the basement would be still, except maybe the faint hum of the old refrigerator. One night, I was sitting on the sofa near the record player, flipping through an album cover, when I caught movement at the edge of my vision. The shadow slid upward along the far wall by the stairs, tall enough that it stretched past the ceiling beam. It moved like it was climbing, but there was nothing casting it, no one on the steps, and the lamp was steady. By the time I looked directly at it, it was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe headlights through a window, though the only basement window faced a wall of hedges. But once you start looking for something like that, your brain doesn't let it go. Even when you try to ignore it, part of you is tuned to every small shift of light or sound. Psychologists say that when unusual things happen in a home, sounds with no source, shadows you can't explain, it can actually train your mind into a constant state of alertness. You stay ready for more without realizing it, and that makes everything louder, sharper, harder to dismiss. It's not just adults. Kids can get stuck in that loop too, and it messes with your ability to sleep. I didn't know that at the time, but I felt it. After the shadow, I started lying awake in the room we'd been given upstairs, listening. Sometimes it was just the normal settling noises of a house at night, but other times there'd be a faint creak from the basement stairs, or a low whine from one of the dogs right before they went into that half-barking mode. I'd picture them down there, staring at the empty corner until their hackles rose. Those moments stretched long, and it was hard to tell how much time was actually passing. There's something about the basement itself that made it worse. It was comfortable enough by day, but at night it felt cut off from the rest of the house. You'd go down after dark and notice how much quieter it was. Sounds didn't travel the same, footsteps felt muffled, voices didn't carry far. That separation made it easier to imagine there was something there you couldn't hear until it wanted you to. 2 nights before we left, it escalated. We'd just finished a late dinner, and the adults were upstairs watching TV. I went down to grab my phone charger from the sofa near the record player. The dogs followed me halfway down the stairs, then stopped. I walked across to the sofa, bent to pick up the charger, and heard the knocks. They weren't at the bathroom this time. They were on the wall next to the piano. 3 solid knocks, spaced evenly apart. The dogs started barking from the stairway, ears pinned forward, staring past me. I didn't turn to look at the wall. I just walked back to the steps, trying not to run. That night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Lying there in the guest bed, I kept replaying the sound of the knocks in my head. Every small noise in the house felt amplified. The adults didn't seem to notice anything. No one mentioned hearing the dogs, or the knocks, or anything else. But in my mind, it was all connected. The dog's behavior, the timing of the knocks, the shadow. Each thing on its own could be nothing, but all together, night after night, it was too much to write off. The next evening, my mom noticed I was quieter. I told her I hadn't slept well and that the dogs barked a lot at night. She said maybe they were reacting to raccoons outside. But the dogs only barked when they were looking in, not out. She didn't press, but the following morning she mentioned to my dad that maybe we should cut the visit short. There was no big announcement about leaving for any reason, just a quiet agreement to head home a couple days early. The last night we stayed there, I avoided going into the basement at all. I brushed my teeth upstairs, packed most of my things before dinner. Even so, when I was lying there trying to drift off, I thought I heard the sound of someone walking very slowly up the basement steps. Not heavy enough for an adult, not quick enough to be a pet. Just that steady creak, pause, creak, like whoever it was didn't need to rush. The sound faded before it reached the top.
In the years since, I've had other nights in other houses where something felt off. But that basement stands out. Maybe because I was younger or because it went on for days instead of once. It left this mark where basements, music rooms, and even the sound of dogs barking into a corner feel different to me now. When you grow up hearing stories about haunted houses, you think of them as dramatic events, screaming in the night, objects moving on their own. But sometimes, it's just the quiet, consistent things that wear you down. Knocks when you're alone in a room, shadows in your peripheral vision, animals reacting to something you can't sense. You start to anticipate it, and that anticipation trains you not to rest. Over time, your sleep gets shallow. You wake a little earlier, you stay up a little longer. By the time you leave, you're relieved, but part of you still listens for it, just in case. We didn't talk much about the basement after that trip. It stayed one of those family visits that you remember vaguely, more for the people than the details. But when my mom later mentioned visiting them again one summer, I said I'd rather stay in a motel. No one asked why. Maybe they already knew the feeling of that basement in the back of their minds and didn't want to put it into words. Some houses don't like guests.
I couldn't scream, even as his arm went around my neck. We were in Baltimore for a week, staying with relatives on the east side. It wasn't the tourist postcard version, more row houses than landmarks, corner stores on every block. My aunt lived in a tall, narrow brick place with worn steps and a deep porch. It was late afternoon and the house was busy with voices, kids running around, pots rattling in the kitchen. I offered to run down to the little market a few blocks away to grab ginger ale and bread before dinner. It felt easy, familiar enough. My mom reminded me to take a jacket. The sun was low but still bright, and the streets were in that quiet gap between afternoon errands and the evening rush. I passed a couple of people on their stoops, a man unloading plastic bags from his car, 2 kids sharing a skateboard along the cracked sidewalk. I was halfway back with the grocery bag balanced against my hip when I noticed the narrow alley splitting off from the main street 2 houses ahead. My route would take me right past it. I didn't see him until I was level with the opening,
A man stepped out from the brick wall faster than I could react. He came from my left, arm hooking suddenly around my neck from behind the side. It wasn't a hard choke, but a hold, pulling me backwards into the shadow of the alley. The bag slid from my arm and hit the ground. I tried to yell, but nothing came out. My throat closed on the effort. The air caught before I could push it into a sound. He didn't say anything, just moved us deeper between the walls, out of sight of the street. I caught the faint smell of tobacco on his sleeve, heard the scrape of shoes shifting on grit and broken glass. My hands came up to grab his arm, nails dragging against the fabric of his jacket, but it kept pulling in short jerks. My shoes scuffed against the concrete, leaving faint lip marks in the dust on the surface. For a second, my brain split, part of me desperate to find a way to yell or kick, the other part counting how far we were getting from the street. I could still see the bright rectangle of sidewalk at the alley mouth, but it was shrinking. And then, without warning, there was a shout. A man's voice, urgent, louder than anything else in that space. I couldn't make out the words, but the grip on my neck jolted. The arm loosened just enough for me to inhale sharply, and two figures came toward us fast from the sidewalk side. They didn't stop to ask questions. They went straight to pulling him back. One grabbed the shoulder of his jacket, the other stepping between us. The sudden shift broke my balance, and I stumbled forward, catching myself on the wall. It was all motion after that. The two strangers forcing him back toward the open street, his feet slipping on loose gravel as he tried to twist away. One kept a hand pressed against his chest, while the other made short, sharp movements with their free arm, pointing toward the main road as if telling him to get out. I stayed where I was, back against the cold brick, breathing hard and watching without really feeling my hands or legs.
He turned once, maybe to glare, maybe to check if I was still there, but the man blocking him shifted his stance and he looked away. They moved him toward the open street until all three shapes were in the sunlight. Then the man in the jacket broke loose and walked quickly in the opposite direction, disappearing around a corner without looking back. Saza lando muken. The two strangers came back into the alley, still breathing heavy. One of them asked if I was hurt. I shook my head. My voice wasn't much yet. It stayed somewhere between my chest and throat. My groceries were still where they had fallen, the ginger ale bottle rolling on its side, catching the weak light. The bag looked too normal, like it didn't belong to what had just happened. Saza lando muken. They walked with me the rest of the way to my aunt's, not talking much. Their presence was enough. At the corner near a house, they stopped. One of them said to tell my family and to keep to the main streets. The instructions were calm, almost routine, but the way he glanced over his shoulder told me he was still alert. I thanked them, and they walked on. I didn't ask their names. Saza lando muken. They walk in minute to the alley. Saza lando muken. Inside, the house was loud again. My mom saw my face and told me to sit down while she called my aunt from the kitchen. I could barely explain it in order, so the words came out in fragments. Aunt Louise pressed her hand to her chest when I got to the part about the arm around my neck. My uncle said he knew that alley, said it was always trouble after dark and sometimes before. He wanted to call someone, but I told him I just wanted to stay in. That night at dinner, the talk circled around what had happened. Second-hand stories from neighbors about people pulled into cars, fights breaking out behind the corner store, the way some streets shifted quickly between safe and unsafe, without looking much different. Someone mentioned how lucky it was those two men happened to be there. Ma. Even without the details, the fact is that bystanders can make the difference in stopping someone from being taken further out of sight. There's no guarantee anyone will step in, but when they do, it changes the outcome. Not everyone can or will intervene physically, but even disrupting the moment, drawing attention, blocking an exit, can jolt the situation enough to help a person break free. That's what they did in that alley. It wasn't a plan, just decisive action in the space of seconds. A bet stories too much. The rest of the week felt different. I didn't want to walk alone, even in full daylight. Every errand was a group effort. conversations happening close as we moved, everyone glancing at the gaps between buildings. I kept seeing that narrowing rectangle of light at the alley entrance in my head, the way the air got cooler as we moved deeper into it. The sound of my own shoes dragged just out of rhythm with my steps. The faith sits one. On our last day, my uncle drove me past that alley on the way to the highway. He slowed only slightly, and I saw the same brick walls, the same uneven ground. No hint of what had happened there except in my memory. People were passing by without looking in. It made me wonder how many times something like that could happen in plain view of a dozen windows and still rely on just one or two people to change the ending. We moved back east not long after, away from the city and back to smaller suburbs. I didn't return to that neighborhood again. My aunt eventually sold the house, saying the upkeep was too much, and she wanted to be closer to her kids. I didn't ask if safety was part of it. My memory of that visit is narrowed down to the inside of that alley and the hands that kept me from getting pulled any further. The image that holds is not of the man walking away, but of the split second when I couldn't breathe or call out, and then suddenly there were other hands pulling, blocking, stepping between. The moment when the alley's grip broke. Huandareko. Sometimes the only thing between you and the dark is a stranger's hands. He said he wanted to pray with us, but his smile didn't match his eyes. The day had already gone off plan before we met him. Our mission trip had been moving between small towns, helping with supply drops and some repair work. But a van breakdown left us walking from the gas station on the edge of town toward the church we were supposed to meet for dinner. About halfway there, a man came out from a house near the main road, thin, wearing a long-sleeved shirt despite the heat, skin on his neck and cheeks marked with patches that looked raw or healed over from something old. He asked where we were from, and when we said we were with a church group, his face lit up in this way that felt half genuine, half calculated. "You ought to come in," he told us. "Could use some prayer here." He had this way of speaking that made it seem like refusing would be wrong. None of us wanted to be rude. There were 4 of us, all in our 20s, but still used to deferring to older people on trips like this, so we followed him up his porch steps. The front room was dim, curtains pulled tight, a single lamp glowing in the corner. The smell was faintly sour, like damp clothes. He offered us chairs, then sat close on the edge of one himself, leaning forward on his knees like he wanted to keep us from thinking about the door behind him. I noticed the print of his shirt stretched tight across his shoulders. He started by talking about God, about hard times, but within minutes it shifted. Told us about cousins in prison, 2 for fighting, 1 for a serious charge he didn't specify. Told us about his own time in county lockup after getting in trouble with someone who had it coming. His gaze switched between our faces like he was waiting to see if any of us would flinch at the hints. I sat back in my chair, trying to keep my shoulders loose. The hallway behind him was even darker than the room. He got up to get water, came back without any. At some point, we heard a thud from further back in the house. He paused mid-sentence, glanced toward it long enough for the silence to stretch, then smiled again. "Old house, makes noise." We were already uneasy when one of the others asked if we could pray with him now so we could get back before dark. He nodded, motioning for us to go into the next room. The 4 of us stepped in, and immediately I noticed the difference in light. Just one bare bulb in the ceiling, a little lower than normal, and the shadows on the walls moved when someone shifted their weight. The walls themselves were close. If 2 of us stood side by side, our elbows grazed the sides.
While he was talking about his family, names, sentences, where they'd served time, he walked toward the door we'd passed through and closed it softly. The sound of the lock was small but sharp. Nobody said anything in that second, not even me, though my chest tightened. He kept talking, jumping from story to story. Then, outside, past the thin window behind him, something moved. It was fast and low, cutting across the narrow strip of yard. You almost couldn't see it unless you were already looking. I couldn't make out a shape that made sense, not an animal I recognized. It seemed solid but wrong in its motion, faster than someone running, seeming to bend around the edge of the fence before stopping short.
One of my friends saw it too. I could tell from the way she froze and her eyes clicked toward mine for a split second. The man hadn't noticed or didn't care. He kept talking about the right way to handle a fight, his voice slower now. The noise came next. Not inside, outside, but close enough that it rattled the glass in the frame of the small window. The sharp sound of something hitting the ground and then a scrape like nails on packed dirt. It was over in seconds, but it shifted the air in the room. When you're in an unfamiliar house and someone else controls the door, you start to feel every second differently. My palms were slick. I remember thinking how narrow the hallway had been between the porch and this room. How if we all tried to leave at once, we'd have to push past him in a single line. He said something about wanting us to meet his uncle. He's just out back, and half stood, his weight already turning toward the locked door. That was it for me. I don't remember making a plan, just moving. I stepped forward, reached for the knob, and twisted harder than I had to. The click, when it opened, was louder than the lock had been. One of my friends slipped through first, then the others. He was still talking behind us, voice curious more than angry, like he couldn't decide if we'd misunderstood. Down the hallway now, past the lamp and the curtained front room. The air smelled sharper near the door, cooler. We didn't wait for each other, just poured out onto the porch and down the steps toward the road. Our van wasn't far, parked on the side where we'd left it, keys out before we even reached it. My friend in the passenger seat kept turning around to look behind us as I got in and started the engine. The man was still on the porch, hand resting on the frame of the door, half a smile on his face. He called something we didn't catch, but he didn't move closer. We pulled away without speaking. Only when the house was a block behind did someone exhale hard enough to break the silence. No one said, "What was that?" or "Did you see it?" Because all of us had, in our own way. The man with his locked doors and sudden stories of violence, the movement outside that didn't match anything local, the noise that felt too close. Later, back on familiar ground, I learned that situations like that, where someone uses the covering of religion or help to invite strangers in, are known ways for people to gain control over others quickly. It's about trust as a tool, with the setting making it harder for you to refuse. In our case, the word prayer and the connection to church life made it feel impolite to walk away as soon as the mood shifted. That's exactly what can make these situations dangerous. The social expectation to stay, listen, and not insult your host, even when your instincts say to leave. I thought about that when I replayed the afternoon in my head. It would have been better to leave the moment the door locked. We could have said we were late for the church dinner and gone without waiting for permission. That's the thing I carried after, how politeness can work against safety in moments that feel uncertain, and how stepping out of that mindset fast enough can be the decision that keeps you from getting trapped further. From the van window, as we parked back at the church, the sun was setting hard, long streaks of light through the stained glass. Inside, the noise of people talking and moving chairs was already going, but my focus stayed on the empty glass at the side of the church, the reflection showing that same long, narrow hallway we'd just walked down hours earlier, minus the man and his stories. The air in that side room felt heavy, even without him there. Sikkerturwe, that night, after everyone had left, the building felt quieter than usual. A stillness that had nothing to do with prayer, and everything to do with picturing how close we'd come to not leaving in time. That night, even the church felt too quiet.
Family trips give you stories you hang on to for years, but they also put you in places where everything feels unfamiliar. The streets, the people, even the rules you rely on work differently. You trust strangers because they seem helpful, because you're trying to be polite, because it feels wrong to assume the worst. That's when danger gets close without you noticing right away. Now tell me if something like this has happened to you, or how you think you'd handle it if it did. The scariest thing isn't the place, it's not knowing who else decided to visit that day.
Have you ever trusted someone you met online, only to realize they might be capable of following you everywhere? A 17-year-old freshman thought she was just chatting with a shy Tinder match. Then came the messages. "I'll wait for you. Save myself for you." Sweet at first, maybe, but they quickly turned dark, desperate, and threatening. And when she blocked him, he didn't disappear. He started showing up, outside her dorm, in the dining hall, even on quiet campus paths. Tonight, you'll hear why sometimes the scariest part of online dating is how fast it becomes real life.
He was supposed to be keeping me safe. Instead, he was blocking the way out. We were halfway through our family vacation, the kind of trip where you're always in a big noisy group, cousins arguing over menu choices, parents trying to keep things moving, someone always running late. That night, we chose a restaurant close to our hotel. The dining room was bright and busy, not the sort of place you'd expect to feel uneasy. At the entrance, a security guard opened the door for us. He looked about mid-30s, clean uniform, radio clipped to his shoulder, the kind of person you might automatically trust just for being in that role. As we waited to be seated, he made small talk, asked where we were from, how long we'd be in town. At first, it didn't register as anything more than the usual vacation chatter. He told us he liked talking to visitors, said it was nice to meet good families who smiled and made eye contact. My mom laughed politely. We were led to a corner table, and about 10 minutes later, he was beside us again. No obvious reason to be there. He started asking personal questions. How old was I? Did I have a boyfriend? What kind of music did I like? My dad gave short answers and tried to steer the conversation back to safe territory. But the man kept looking at me instead of anyone else at the table. His tone started changing. Less casual, more pointed. He leaned in toward me and said I seemed exactly the type to make a loyal wife. I froze a little, unsure if I was supposed to brush it off or laugh. My cousin whispered something to my aunt, and I could feel them both watching my reaction. He told me, almost like he was giving advice, that a young woman with manners should find a man who will provide for her, who can protect her from bad people out there. That's when it sunk in. He wasn't just talking about anyone. He was sliding himself into that role. While we ate, he stayed close. Not at our table, but never more than a few steps away. Every time I stood to go to the bathroom, he stepped over with some comment or light joke. Once, he moved aside for another server, but instead of walking away, he angled himself so his back was to the room and I couldn't pass without brushing against him. His eyes held just a second too long, like he was measuring what I would do if he didn't move. Later, when we were between courses, he came back and half sat on the edge of the table next to ours. He started telling me about his ideal partner, someone who listens, who doesn't give attitude, who appreciates a man willing to take charge. My dad interrupted to ask him to give us space so we could eat. That only made the man smirk. He leaned an elbow on the end of our table and spoke lower, saying that if I ever wanted a husband who would treat me right, he knew how to be that man. There's something different about someone in a uniform saying things like this. Authority changes the way people perceive what's happening, and it affects whether you feel you can leave. Research has shown that when authority figures cross lines in public spaces, security, police, even customer service staff, people are less likely to challenge them right away. It's that unspoken imbalance. They're meant to make you feel safe, which makes their attention harder to label as wrong until it's already gone too far.
He came back again once dessert arrived. My appetite was gone by then. He bent down so his face was closer to mine and asked if I wanted to see a quieter place after my family was done eating. His voice had dropped to a low tone, like it was meant to be just between us. I didn't respond, but I must have looked uneasy because my aunt asked aloud what he said. He straightened up, smiled at her, and didn't repeat himself. When we finally got the bill, he positioned himself between our table and the door. He wasn't smiling anymore. He just stood there, shoulders squared, looking directly at me. My heartbeat felt heavy in my neck. My dad moved toward him, maybe to step past, but the movement caught the attention of a man from another table who had been glancing over earlier. He got up and walked straight to the security guard, saying something I couldn't catch. The manager appeared from the bar area almost immediately. There were a few quiet but tense words, and then the guard raised his hands like he was saying fine and moved toward the back door.
The manager came over after that, looking pale. He apologized, said the guard wouldn't be working there anymore, and told us we didn't have to pay for our meal. My family was silent while we collected our things, except for my cousin, who muttered something about how creepy his grin had been when he first came over. Outside, I kept glancing behind us until we reached the hotel. In the hotel room later, I thought about how quickly that dinner turned. One moment, you're just on vacation, letting your guard down because you assume you're in public and everything's fine. The next, someone who's supposed to be part of that safety net is leaning in too close, blocking your path, speaking in ways that make you feel cornered. It's not the dim corners or the empty streets that get you. It's the realization that you might not be able to just get up and walk away.
I thought that would be the worst thing to happen on that trip. I was wrong.
You can't exactly leave when you're in the middle of the ocean. It was Thanksgiving week, and instead of a stuffy dinner at home, my parents decided we'd all take a cruise. The kind with buffets in every direction, a schedule full of shows, and a pool deck that never really emptied. One night, after the formal dinner, a few of us decided to head up to the sports deck. It was late enough that most people were inside at the bars or asleep. The air was cooler, and only the sound of the ball bouncing and the distant churn of the ship's engines broke the quiet. My younger sister was there, along with two of her friends. We shot baskets under the halogen lights, their white glare making the sky seem darker than it was.
That's when I noticed him the first time. He was across the deck, leaning against the railing, partially in shadow. I wouldn't have looked twice if he'd just been passing through, but he stayed there. I could see the lines of tattoos running up his forearms when he adjusted his jacket. Every so often he paced along the railing and then back again, like he was waiting for something. I told myself it was nothing. Plenty of people wander the decks at night. The second night was harder to ignore. We went back to the court again, and maybe 20 minutes in, he was there. Same spot. Not talking to anyone, not playing, just there. His eyes moved between us, stopping longer on the younger girls. He wasn't smiling. He didn't even make the polite nod you'd expect when someone catches you looking. On the third night, I tried an experiment. We left the court early and went to get ice cream on the other side of the ship. When we headed back toward the elevators, I turned around on instinct. He was at the far end of the promenade, walking at a slow pace in the same direction we were going. I didn't mention it right then, but my stomach went tight. Later, all of us were sitting in one of the lounge chairs on an upper deck when he walked past, stopped, and came over. His voice was lower than I expected and almost casual. But the first thing he said was that he recognized us from the starboard sports area. Nobody calls it that unless they've been looking at a map of the ship. He asked where we were staying, like it was normal small talk.
My sister said something vague, but he nodded like he already knew. Then, without much warning, he started talking about how he liked night walks in the crew access zones, and that there were places passengers never get to see, but it was worth it if you know who to ask. One of my cousin's friends laughed in that nervous way people do when they want a conversation to be over.
When you're out at sea, you think about safety in the same way you think about weather. It feels like it's being handled by someone else. But ships don't have the same kind of police presence you're used to on land. Security is there, but they're limited. If something happens hundreds of miles from shore, you can't just call 911 and expect a quick response. It creates this weird sense of isolation, because if a stranger wants to keep finding you, there's nowhere to disappear to except your cabin. The fourth night, it wasn't just watching. We were heading back from ping pong near the pool when I noticed my sister's friend was missing from our group. She'd been walking just ahead of us a minute earlier. I turned and saw her at the edge of a doorway that led to one of those narrow crew stairwells. He was standing beside it, angled so his body blocked most of the entrance, leaning toward her like he was giving directions. Her shoulders were pulled in, and her eyes kept flicking toward us. I walked faster and called her name out loud. His head turned, and for just a second, his expression shifted into something flat, like the conversation had been interrupted. She stepped quickly back toward us without explaining, but her face looked tight.
That was enough for me. We told the others we were heading back to the cabin and locked the door once we were inside. My sister's friend wouldn't say exactly what he'd said, only that he told her there was something on one of the lower decks worth seeing, and that he could get her access, because he knew people who worked down there. She kept repeating that she'd tried to walk away, but he'd kept stepping slightly to the side to match her movement. The rest of that night we stayed put. The rocking of the ship felt heavier, though I don't know if it was the water or my nerves making it seem that way. Every sound in the hallway made me check the peephole. At some point in the early morning, I heard footsteps, a slow pace, then a pause, then more steps. It could have been anyone, but I didn't open the door. You tell yourself that in a place with thousands of people, you'll blend in. But the reality is, on a ship, patterns form fast. You eat in the same dining rooms, walk the same corridors, show up to the same events. It wouldn't take much for someone to figure out your routine, and if they're determined, they can plan to cross your path over and over without it technically breaking any rules. We thought maybe avoiding the decks at night would solve it. The next morning, we slept late, skipped breakfast, and went straight to the main dining room for brunch. He was already there, casually leaning against the host's podium, talking to a staff member, laughing like he belonged anywhere. He looked over at our table as we were being seated, and this time he smiled. Not the polite kind, just a slow curve of the mouth, eyes steady. Then he turned back to the conversation like we weren't worth any more attention. I tried to eat, but the clink of utensils and the murmur of voices felt wrong. My sister kept her eyes down, and her friend picked at her bread without taking a bite. Everyone at the table noticed him at least once, but nobody said anything out loud. There's an unspoken rule among families on vacation. You try not to ruin the mood. But that morning, the whole easy holiday atmosphere had changed. After brunch, we walked the long way back to our rooms, up a deck, over to the other staircase, down again, trying not to take the same route too many times. I realized how small the ship felt when you were actively avoiding someone. Hallways that had seemed like endless mazes now felt like traps with only one exit. Even standing on an open deck, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I turned around fast enough, I'd see him watching again.
Ships feel big until you're trying to hide from someone. Out here, your home is only as safe as the asphalt under it. We'd been on the road for 2 weeks, zigzagging between national parks and small towns, and that night, the Walmart parking lot in a mid-sized southern city was the best option. It was well lit, with other RVs scattered along the far edge. The store itself was still open, casting that familiar bluish glow across the lot. Our little RV wasn't much, converted from a work van, but it had a small bed, 2 lounging seats that folded down, and enough space for the pets to curl up comfortably. We'd done this plenty of times. The rules were unspoken. You park away from the busiest entrance, stay out of the way, and you're usually fine until morning. We let the dogs out for a walk along the perimeter before settling in. The night air felt heavy in that way it sometimes does before a storm, but the forecast was clear. Inside, we switched to dim battery lights, made some tea, and queued up a show on the laptop. It was one of those calm evenings where the quiet feels earned. That's when the van appeared. Plain white, no windows on the sides, the kind that could pass for a delivery vehicle or someone's old work rig. It pulled into the aisle right next to ours, going slow enough that I noticed the driver's head turn toward us as he went past. I didn't think much of it until he circled the lot and came back. This time, he took the lane directly in front of our RV, moving even slower. The dogs got up and stood at the side window, ears forward. The man didn't wave or look away when I made eye contact. He just kept rolling past. By the third time, my chest was tight. He parked 2 rows over and left his headlights on. The beam hit the side of our vehicle, casting that washed-out rectangle of light across the bed. He wasn't looking at a phone or adjusting the radio, just sitting still in the driver's seat, facing us.
There's a certain kind of unease that hits when you realize how isolated you actually are in a place like that. In the city, you can yell and expect someone to hear. On a highway, you know help is at least moving around you. In a parking lot at night, surrounded by businesses that are closed or nearly empty, there's this dead zone. I've read enough trip reports to know that police don't arrive quickly for suspicious vehicle calls in large lots unless something active is happening. And even then, it can take longer than anyone would hope. That thought sat in the back of my mind while I watched him through the crack in the curtain. The dogs started pacing between the bed and the door, letting out low whines instead of barking. I wondered if I should put them in the crate so they wouldn't draw attention, but then thought about how they might be the only warning we get if something crossed the line. I whispered to my partner that we should move. He didn't argue. We kept the lights off inside and climbed into the front quietly, pulling out of the row and heading toward the other side of the lot, where there was a cluster of semis parked. The Walmart closed in less than an hour, which meant more of the lot would empty soon, and I wanted as much distance as possible. We curled up by the far fence line. Engine off, curtains pulled. I told myself he wasn't going to make the effort to find us. For a few minutes, it seemed true. Then, in the reflection of the rearview mirror, I saw those same headlights sweep across the rows. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't making it obvious. The van made a slow circuit of the far end before pulling into our aisle again. Same pattern. Drive-by, driver's face turning just enough to look. I could see the side of his jaw in the dull light from a nearby lamp. My partner's hand was on the ignition. We didn't speak.
We moved again, this time to the complete opposite end of the property, near a garden center gate. As we turned in, I spotted him parked at an angle in the middle of an empty stretch, facing toward the main entrance. Maybe he saw us. Maybe not. We parked behind another large RV, hoping the bulk would shield us, and waited. I kept glancing through the tiny gap in our curtain until my eyes started to hurt.
It's strange, the whole thing probably took less than an hour, but in my head it stretches long, like a night that never ends. The sound of tires on asphalt, the low hum of an idling engine, the flash of bright light through a film-covered window. I imagine getting out to walk the dogs again and seeing that van eased just far enough into the shadows to be almost invisible. The idea made my stomach turn. Eventually, I realized his headlights were gone. No sound of movement, no slow passes, just the usual minor noise of a parking lot. Someone shutting a car door 2 rows away, the distant beep of a truck backing up from the loading dock. I kept waiting for him to reappear. Every scrape of tires in the lot felt like it could be him.
We didn't go to bed right away. Neither of us said it out loud, but sleeping felt like letting our guard drop too much, too soon. We sat in the dim inside light, the dogs curled up tight against us, while the laptop on the counter played the same episode of our show twice. My hand rested on the small flashlight I keep by the door, while my partner kept his eyes on the side mirror. There was nothing moving out there that matched the shape of that white van, but the possibility hung over both of us. By the time I lay down for real, closing the curtain to block the last of the parking lot glow, the feeling still hadn't lifted. I kept picturing that first moment we saw him rolling past, the deliberate slowness, eyes trained more on our space than on where he was going. We'd been lucky that he didn't push harder that night, lucky that nothing happened beyond the watching. But even as I clung to that thought, the unease edged back in. Luck isn't a plan. The rest of the night, every passing headlight made me sit up.
The locals told us not to go, but teenagers don't listen. We were in a fishing town on the coast of Newfoundland, visiting an old friend of my mom's. The air off the water made everything smell faintly like salt and iron. People spent their days mending nets or cutting through the harbor in small boats, and by evening the main road would be almost empty. We'd been there a few days before anyone brought up the name Mother Hilda. It happened when a group of us, mostly local teens our age, were talking about how boring the town felt after dark. One boy leaned in and said quietly that there was a house up on the ridge where she used to live. He said nobody lived there now, but sometimes you could still hear her. It was vague, like all urban legends are, something about an old midwife who went out to neighbors' houses during the winter storms, who never turned away anyone sick or in trouble. The way they told it, she didn't just help babies into the world. She took care of other things too, things she didn't speak about. The story shifted depending on who talked. Some said she could cure any illness for a price. Others said she'd curse you if you crossed her. In every version, it ended the same way. She died alone in her upstairs room with no one willing to climb the stairs to see her body.
Everyone had a reason not to go up to the house.
Roofs loose from years of wind, stairboards rotting, the sense it wasn't right to trespass. But someone always added that you could still hear her walking in that room if you got close enough. We laughed about it at first, but that laugh had a thin edge to it. You could tell the locals weren't just passing the time with a story. A few nights later, we decided to go up there. It was me, my sister, and 2 of the local teens who pretended they weren't scared. The path twisted through grass and jagged rock until it reached a steep rise. At the top sat the house, thin, weather-beaten, paint gone to gray. One upstairs window was missing completely, and the salty air moved through the opening like a breath. The front steps sagged but held. Inside, the smell was damp wood and dust, and every sound we made ricocheted through the hallway. The others whispered to each other, but my voice stayed caught in my throat. We moved slow toward the staircase at the back, our flashlights throwing crooked shadows on the peeling wallpaper. That was when I heard it. The low hum of something like a chant. It was too steady to be wind. We froze halfway up the stairs. The local girl with us mouthed that it had to be an echo from outside, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. The sound kept going, just below hearing, but enough that if you focused, you could pick out breaks in it, like someone was pausing for breath between phrases. I didn't recognize the language. The top hallway was short, lined with 2 doors on either side and one at the end. Every step toward that back door made the air feel heavier. The chanting, or whatever it was, seemed to leak out from behind it. My flashlight caught something on the floor, and for a flash of a second I thought it was rope, but the strands were too brittle. Probably plant stems blown in from the missing window. The door to the far room was closed. Not warped shut, just closed. We stood in front of it, and my sister reached for the knob. That's when I saw movement in the thin gap between the door and the frame. At first, I thought it was the curtain inside stirring, until the shape shifted upward. A pale surface, an elbow maybe, but bent at a wrong angle, sticking backward from the arm instead of forward. There was a slowness to it that made it worse. It wasn't jerking or twitching, just moving like it had no hurry. I told her to stop. None of us spoke much above a whisper now. The boy with us stepped around to the side, trying to see if there was another way in, but the wall against his shoulder was cold and solid. I leaned just enough to glimpse the edge of something else behind that door. It might have been a shoulder, but it was too high if the elbow was that low. Even in the weak light, it looked wrong. That was the moment I started thinking about how these kinds of local stories survive. In remote places, folktales aren't only about entertainment, they're a kind of warning system. The details change, but the core stays the same, so people learn where not to go, who not to trust. It doesn't matter if the reason sounds supernatural or not. Something happened in that house a long time ago that made people agree on the important part. Stay away from the upstairs room. Without warning, the hallway went dark. My flashlight didn't flicker, it simply went out along with the others. The chanting stopped at the same moment. My ears rang in the sudden silence. For one long breath, there was nothing, and then the sound of something shifting weight on the other side of the door. I must have closed my eyes because when I opened them again, I wasn't upstairs anymore. I was outside, standing in the patch of flattened grass at the side of the house. My sister was 2 steps ahead of me, breathing hard, eyes wide. The others were there too, all facing the ridge that led back toward town. No one knew how we'd moved from that hallway to the yard. None of us remembered backing down the stairs or opening the front door or even talking before we left. It was like 1 second we were there and the next we were out. The wind was louder now, rattling the loose siding. My legs felt shaky, as though we'd been running, though my memory didn't match the feeling. When someone finally broke the silence, it was to say we should go. The walk back was fast, downhill most of the way, and nobody turned to look behind us. Back in the light of our friend's kitchen, we tried to compare what each of us had seen. My sister remembered the bent elbow, but nothing else. The boy said all he saw was something pale move near the crack of the door. The girl said her flashlight had stayed on until it didn't. No dimming, no warning, just off. None of us tried to explain the part about waking up outside. We didn't have anything to connect it to in a way that made sense.
Later that night, when the adults came in from their own gathering, they noticed we were quieter than usual. We didn't tell them where we'd been. The local teams never brought it up again. If I tried, they'd change the subject or leave the room. It was as if agreeing to talk about it might pull something forward from that empty upstairs space. In the morning, the ridge looked normal from a distance. The house was small against the backdrop of water and sky, nothing about it demanding attention. But I couldn't stop noticing how the upper window caught the light differently than the rest. Not brighter or darker, just different. We left town a couple of days later. As we drove away, I could still picture that final stretch of hallway, the way the sound had poured into it from the closed room, and the shape leaning just far enough into the gap to be seen. It burned into my mind, not for how much it moved,
but for how little. Some places keep you even after you've left. Most breakups don't require a passport to escape. We had been engaged for almost a year when he called it off. There wasn't even a fight before that, just a sudden conversation one night where he said he wasn't ready. I thought maybe he would need some space. Maybe it could work out later. Then 2.5 weeks later, I saw the wedding photos on my feed. Him in the same suit he'd been planning to wear for hours, smiling next to someone I'd never met. The date on the photos made it obvious. There had been overlap. All my things had already been shipped back to me, neat boxes with my handwriting on the lids where I'd packed them for his apartment. It was like I'd been erased, replaced, and filed away in less than a month. I tried to rebuild, moved to a small apartment downtown, changed my coffee shop schedule to avoid the places we'd gone together. The first time I saw him again after the wedding was 2 years later in Vancouver. I was leaving a bookstore near the waterfront when I caught his reflection in the glass door. He was across the street, just standing by a lamppost, hands in his pockets. He didn't call out or wave. I went back inside and waited behind a shelf of travel guides until he was gone. A year after that, it was Auckland. I was working for a tour company then, handling bookings and group itineraries. He walked straight into the office one slow Thursday morning. His hair was a little longer, a gold band still on his left hand. He smiled like nothing was wrong and asked if I remembered him. The other staff were looking at me for context, curious. I felt my face heat up. He said, "I'm here on holiday. We should have dinner." I told him no. His smile didn't fade. He just said I'd change my mind. After that, he kept finding me. New city, new job. It didn't matter. It wasn't constant. Months, sometimes a year, would go by without a trace. And then he'd appear in the most ordinary places. Once it was at a train platform in Sydney. Once in a market in Lisbon. Sometimes he would try to start a conversation. Sometimes he just stared for a moment before moving on. I kept thinking, maybe I was imagining it, but then the messages would arrive. He'd make references to projects I was working on, details about trips I hadn't posted anywhere public. He never yelled or threatened violence directly. Instead, it was about money. He reminded me of the savings account we'd opened together, still in both our names, even though it had barely had anything in it when I withdrew my share. He said if I spoke badly about him, he could adjust my credit score from an account he still had access to. He brought up my social security number, which I'd given him years earlier for a rental application we'd signed together. Nothing happened right away, but the implications stayed there, heavy.
One of the worst moments came in Madrid. I'd been working at a language school for only 3 weeks when he showed up in the doorway of the classroom while I was in the middle of a lesson. He didn't say a word, just stood there until the administrator came by and asked him to leave. After that, I stayed late just to make sure he wasn't waiting outside. When I finally left, he was sitting on a bench halfway down the street, tapping his phone. The problem was that every time I looked into what I could do legally, there was nothing that covered it cleanly. Stalking laws vary a lot from country to country. Some places require proof of threats or physical harm before they'll even file a report. Others won't pursue a case if incidents are spread out over months or years. And if the person following you keeps moving between countries, like he did, every jurisdiction treats it like its own isolated event. What happened in Vancouver meant nothing to the police in Auckland, and what happened in Auckland had no weight in Spain. Even restraining orders, when you can get them, usually stop at the border. I learned to change small habits. I used cash whenever I could. I stopped telling most people where I was headed next. At jobs, I gave as little personal information as possible, sometimes using an old address on forms. When I booked flights, I picked routes with layovers just to make the arrival city harder to guess. But no matter how careful I was, every time I saw him, part of me felt like I had failed to stay hidden.
5 years in, I started having a recurring dream where we were sitting across from each other in an airport cafe. I never recognized the city, and he never spoke. He just watched, hands clasped, like he was waiting for something. I'd wake up with my throat tight, scanning my apartment for signs that anything had been disturbed. It became a habit to lock the bedroom door, even if that only gave me a sense of control instead of actual security. The last time I saw him was in Montreal. It was winter, and the sidewalks were edged with snow. I was walking fast, trying to reach the metro before my gloves soaked through. He came out of a side street just ahead of me, eyes fixed straight forward until we were at the same point. Then he turned his head slowly, held my gaze for a few steps, and kept walking. No smile, no greeting, just that look. For weeks after, I kept expecting him to appear again. It took a decade before I made a change that stuck. I left the travel work behind and moved to a smaller, quieter city, in a country where I didn't know anyone and no one really knew me. I picked an apartment under a name that wasn't the one I used professionally. I got a part-time job that didn't list my full name anywhere public. For the first time in years, I went months without scanning every face in a crowd twice. I didn't feel entirely safe, but the constant weight in my gut was lighter. Sometimes I still catch myself brushing my thumb over my phone's lock screen the second I notice a stranger looking at me too long. The reflex is there, permanently now. If I'm in a crowded station, I'll move to stand with a wall at my back. I can't tell if that's being smart or just living in anticipation of him returning. Maybe it's both. Even with all the distance, I think about how easy it was for him to step back into my life each time. No matter how far I went, the things he knew about me, my family, my habits from years ago, the places I'd like to go, gave him a direct line into where to look. And wherever he ended up, all it took was him buying a ticket. Some ghosts are alive, and they buy plane tickets. He couldn't follow me fast until he did. It was early, just after 6, and the metro station near my apartment was still half asleep. Pale tiles, cold air drifting down from the street, the dull hum of escalators. Paris at that hour didn't feel dangerous to me, just groggy and quiet. I was working the morning prep shift in a hotel kitchen, so I rode the same line every day, headphones in, coat zipped up, eyes on the tiled floor until my train arrived. That morning, I noticed him as soon as I stepped onto the platform. He was in an electric wheelchair, one of the larger ones with a headrest and a storage pouch hanging off the back. Middle-aged, short hair, plain jacket. He looked up when I walked past to stand near one of the marked boarding spots. The train was a minute out, and I could already hear it rushing in the tunnel. "Bonjour," he said in a friendly tone. I nodded back, polite enough not to seem rude. It was normal for people to kill time with small talk before a train. He asked if I was American. I said yes. That opened the door. He asked how I liked Paris, if I worked here, if I had a boyfriend. The questions rolled out quickly, faster than I could think of excuses to end them. The train pulled in and I stepped on, expecting the conversation to end there. But he guided his chair in right behind me, maneuvering toward the open area by the doors. I claimed a spot by one of the poles, facing forward. He stayed angled toward me. At first, it was harmless enough. He made a comment about the cold morning, asked if I liked my job. Then, without much change in tone, he asked if I would kiss him. I laughed once, short, like I hadn't heard him right. He repeated it. A kiss, just one. I said no. He shrugged, but kept looking at me. The movement of the chair was slight, rolling forward an inch, then back, as though he was getting comfortable. He asked where I lived. I said vaguely, in the city, and put my headphones back in, hoping that would make it clear. That should have been the end of it. But at the next station, when the doors opened, he rolled out ahead of me and stopped just outside. I thought he was leaving. At the last moment, before the tone sounded, he rolled back on, positioning himself by the same doors. The next stop, same thing.
out just far enough to make me think the path was clear, then back in, always ending up facing me.
By now, I was hyper-aware of the distance between us, the sound of the motor when he adjusted position, the way people glanced but didn't interfere. My eyes kept jumping to the station exits, counting stairs, imagining the timing I'd need if I wanted to leave without him following. The problem was that on a metro platform, you can't exactly dodge someone without making it obvious. He asked again if I would kiss him. Then, "Maybe you can come home with me instead." I shook my head, kept my headphones in, let my gaze slide past him like I hadn't heard. Inside, my chest was tight. I could feel the weight of the situation, the confined space, the steady persistence, the fact that in that moment, I didn't have an easy way out. 3 more stops like that, in, out, always keeping me in sight. Once, when I gripped the pole and steadied my feet at a sharp turn, he leaned forward slightly and asked my name. I didn't give it. He said we'd be good together, in the same way you'd say the weather would be nice that afternoon. No change in tone, like it was just a statement of fact. I started planning. I knew 2 stops ahead there was a junction where you could transfer between lines by running up one flight of stairs and down another. If I moved fast enough, maybe he wouldn't be able to follow. The thought made my pulse quicken. I shifted my bag higher on my shoulder, ready to move.
At the transfer station, the doors slid open, and I stepped out quickly, turning toward the connecting staircase without glancing back. I could hear the whine of his motor behind me. The footsteps of other passengers blurred into the noise of the station. I took the stairs 2 at a time. For a moment, I let myself think it would work. Then the sound erupted louder on the right. He'd taken the central lift to the same landing. I caught sight of him emerging into the corridor, scanning. I turned hard into a side passage that led to the opposite platform for the same line. At the top of those stairs, I blended into a group waiting for the next train, going back the way I had come. My breath was shallow, my ears tuned for any mechanical hum. No sound, no sign of him. The train arrived. I stepped on, and my shoulders didn't drop until the doors closed. Even then, I kept checking the reflections in the windows, half expecting to see him at the next station, repositioning in front of the doors the same way he had all morning. I thought distance would solve it. But the next day, while I was setting out trays in the kitchen, I glanced toward the entrance of the hotel and saw him there, just inside the lobby. The same jacket, the same neutral expression. He didn't call to me, didn't wheel closer, just sat, eyes steady. One of the front desk staff walked over, and I turned away, pretending I hadn't seen him.
That was when I knew this wasn't just one bad commute. He knew where I worked. He could wait anywhere I might have to be, even in broad daylight. The thought left me tense for the rest of the shift, watching the corners of the lobby whenever I passed through, wondering how many times he might have been there without me noticing. After that, I changed more than just my metro stop. I avoided the first hour of my usual shift, offering to come in later and leave later just to move my travel outside of the time I'd first met him. I switched lines, even if it doubled my trip. I kept my eyes up as I walked, always aware of who was ahead of me, who was behind. Even now, years later, every time I hear the faint electric whir of a wheelchair motor in a public space, my muscles tense before my mind catches up. It's not something you think will leave a lasting mark until it does. How one person's decision to keep pressing in on your boundaries can wedge itself into the background noise of your daily life. I still remember the way he looked at me each time the doors opened, like I wasn't going anywhere he couldn't follow. That feeling stayed long after he was gone. After that, I changed my route and my hours.